Good evening, everybody. My name is Robert Logan, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Newcastle Institute's webinar series, which is we're doing during COVID-19. Tonight, our topic is maintaining democracy during the COVID-19 crisis. But first, let me just say one or two things. Firstly, I'd like to say that Newcastle has been a place of learning for thousands of years, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I sit, the Awabakal and the Worimi people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. But I'd also like to acknowledge all of those who continue to make Newcastle a place of learning and a place of discovery. Welcome to our members and viewers across Australia and beyond. We have regular viewers in Queensland and the ACT and in Melbourne, and we welcome you as well as all of those here locally. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. If you have a question, you can ask it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or in the comments on the Facebook live stream, which is going live to Facebook for those of you who are watching on Facebook now. We'll take questions from the audience after some discussion by the panel. But firstly, let me just introduce the panel. I'd like to introduce Dr. John Hewson, and John has had a distinguished career in academia, business and politics. He's a former leader of the Liberal Party and is currently chair of the Commission for Human Future. And he is a professorial fellow at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. So welcome, John.
Good evening, Robert. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Our next panellist is Cheryl Curnow. Cheryl is one of the National Trust's 100 National Living Treasures.
That's better than an OBE or whatever they call it.
Cheryl. Cheryl was leader of the Australian Democrats from 1993 to 1997, and the member for Dixon and a Labor shadow minister from 1998 to 2001. Cheryl was also a member of the Council for Reconciliation from 92 to 1997, and Cheryl is currently the Social Business Fellow at the Centre for Social Impact at the University of New South Wales. So welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you, Robert.
And Jim Jose. Professor Jim Jose is Professor of Politics and a political scientist at the University of Newcastle with an interest in political ideas and their impact on everyday life. And Jim is also a regular commentator in the media and highly sought after for his wise and considered counsel. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Robert.
Jim, perhaps I could start a question with you. The COVID crisis has changed our lives. It's changed our recreation. It's changed our relationships. It's changed us in so many ways. It's changed our healthcare systems. It's changed the economy. And of course, it has changed our democracy. Our parliament has only sat for the first time in quite a long time this week. Research from the Australia Institute shows that the community is putting its faith in governments during this time of crisis, and that public trust has now, at least, somewhat recovered from its historic lows. Furthermore, it's government, not business, that the public wants to see take a leadership role in this economic recovery. We have a national cabinet in which there's no opposition voice. Does this meet the test, Jim, of accountability in a democracy? And have we traded democracy in order to manage COVID?
Well, Robert, let me say the short answer to that is no. We haven't created an accountable national cabinet. In the normal run of events, it's a form of COAG, if you like, and COAG's not a body that's accountable to anyone or anything in particular. It's a twice yearly meeting of heads of the states and the territories. The individual premiers or the chief ministers might be accountable to their governments and to their parliaments, but that's about it. The current national cabinet for the COVID crisis was an ad hoc body, and it's similarly not accountable in any democratic sense. It's a product of the same old political practices of the past, an executive that's not really accountable to any other political body. And in theory, our system of government, the federal cabinet, is supposed to be accountable to the parliament. But during the COVID crisis, the federal cabinet's not accountable at all, and the national cabinet neither. As I understand it, technically the National Cabinet became a subcommittee of the Federal Cabinet, which means that any documents, any discussions are privileged. They're part of the sort of formal cabinet situation. And this actually ensures that it's not accountable to the Parliament, because any records of the deliberations and any documents are, to all intents and purposes, subject to cabinet confidentiality. So even if they had involved the federal opposition leader, it wouldn't have made it any more accountable. All it might do would be to give it an air of bipartisanship, but that's about it. Much more substantial systemic reform would be needed to, first of all, create an ongoing national cabinet, and then secondly, to make it accountable in some substantive parliamentary sense. But we're a long way from that, and at present and during the COVID crisis, it's just not accountable at all.
Can I ask if the New Zealand version is cabinet in confidence as well, Jim? Do you know that? Because Jacinda Ardern started from a different premise, didn't she? She said, yes, I really think we should be kept accountable in these difficult times. And so she said, I deliberately want the opposition included and keeping a close eye on what we're doing. But I don't know whether their deliberations are cabinet in confidence. Do you?
No, I can't answer that question in terms of their particular cabinet and the rules governing their cabinet. But you're quite right. She starts from a different premise, and it's a premise of openness and inclusiveness. And it's not just inclusive of the opposition. I think it's reasonable to say it's a sense of inclusiveness about the citizens, the population as a whole, that it's not simply we're the experts or we're the power and we're going to solve the problem. It's that there's a genuine sense, I think, emanating from her office that the New Zealanders, the Maori people, they're all in this together facing a common problem. And it's not just rhetoric, whereas it often appears that when our government says we're all in this together, we're Team Australia, it's in some respects, it reminds me of marketing slogans. And there's certainly no history, if you like, of our current government having a sense of inclusivity in the same way or in a similar fashion to Jacinda Ardern's approach. So we've got a lot to learn.
I think if they were all in it together, they would have included the opposition in this national cabinet, even though, as you say, Jim, it doesn't have the accountability that I think most people would expect. Certainly hasn't got the transparency you would expect. And you don't know much about the link between the professional advisors, the medical experts, as they're referred to, and that cabinet. There's not much transparency about that either. But also, if we're all in it together, I don't know why the government didn't cut the political salaries and the bureaucratic salaries by 20% or something across the board, which again Jacinda Ardern did for a period in New Zealand. I mean, it is a sharing of the burden of this adjustment, which has not been adhered to in our case.
Any precedents for this sort of national cabinet in a time of crisis?
The War Cabinet. And even so, the War Cabinet wasn't strictly bipartisan. I mean, there was a sharing of information, but it's really, it was a Labor government War Cabinet which consulted with the opposition, and there were aspects of it in which there was some degree of bipartisanship. But again, it was still a government-driven entity.
The only way we're getting a little bit of transparency at the moment is the Senate committee, the Senate Select Committee that's been set up. Right down to today discovering that, what's his name, Nev Power, who's part of an unelected, unaccountable task force that's going to design our bridge over the river, what is it? Kwai. Our bridge anyway, which is, I think, is such a silly analogy. It presumes some kind of certainty on the other side, in my view. But the only way we're finding out, things like what's he paid, how much work does he have to do, what is their brief, is through the Senate Select Committee. It's not been offered. Nothing was said when this task force was appointed, except that they all had business networks. And that's the only little inkling we've got at the moment in the midst of silence and probably a certain degree of obfuscation by deliberate omission, in my view.
Many of the more combative politicians have been noticeably quiet. You know, maybe Hanson and Dutton, the bets. On the surface, there appears to be a more respectful discourse in our politics, even though there have been some coordinated attacks against Daniel Andrews. The demonstrations in Melbourne last weekend were perhaps not our finest hour, but there has been some state premiers recently on television, and it seemed to be very respectful and constructive. And Daniel Andrews, I think, has asked for this National Cabinet to continue. And COAG, he says, has never worked anyway. This is working better. Do you think that we should, there's a consensus, Cheryl? Do you think that there is a genuine consensus, or is this just on the surface? And in fact, is cohesion and middle ground and balanced, is that what we want?
Oh, people think they do. The media thinks that if you can all compromise, doesn't matter what the compromise is, that's a really good thing, because it just shows that people are trying to work together. COAG is very, what's the word? Very theatrical. It's become very theatrical over the years. And I don't think it serves a huge purpose at the moment. And all of that work is done by the bureaucratic subcommittees anyway. And we don't hear much of the arguments around the major issues that are taken forward from one COAG to the next. I'd like to be informed what the arguments are all the way along. I'm not confident anyway that a national cabinet could continue to work as well as it is, because unless they're all going to become market-driven neoliberals, or they're going to rediscover some aspects, in the case of the Labor Party, of the things that they used to stand for, I don't see how the ideology is going to be easily left behind. I listened to Question Time today. You're right, I nearly forgot Parliament existed. And it came on, and I thought I'll just have a listen to see what the tone is. And while it was slightly less combative, the old scripts were there. I cannot be very confident, I'm sorry to say, that we probably need to demolish the whole edifice and start again if I'm to have any confidence in having a new system, because all of the buttresses that we used to have, not just a COAG, but the things like FOI, freedom of information, access, ministerial codes of conduct where prime ministers actually enforce them, Senate estimates committees where the public servants actually answered the questions instead of taking 50% of them on notice to come back within who knows when, but certainly not during that week when estimates are sitting. All of those things have been really steadily eroded. And unless we're going to get the two major parties decide to recommit to different forms of democracy, then I don't think that a continuing national cabinet would be, I'm not saying it's not worth trying, but I just don't think it's the answer to what I'm looking for in terms of deep, widespread accountability. I'm looking for a federal ICAC for starters.
Well, in terms of what you're saying, Cheryl, I think it's dead right. The Westminster system, as it once existed and as we continue to imagine it, no longer functions in the way in which it was imagined to function. I mean, if we go back to the sort of rise before the time of entrenched political parties, the idea was that the Parliament was a space where alliances were made and broken, and where the executive, that is to say, the sort of the body of ministers who form the government, they were genuinely at risk if they didn't sort of toe a line, so to speak, be accountable and to some extent transparent. So what you got then was that the Parliament had some power, but now over 150, 200 years with the entrenched party system now as a two-party system more or less, there is no real parliamentary accountability because it's basically a numbers game. And the government, which has the numbers in the lower house, is rarely going to get pushed against its will to do stuff. Occasionally it happens, but it's usually extraordinary circumstances rather than the standard run-of-the-mill being accountable to the Parliament for their decisions. And you're quite right. I think we need a federal ICAC to actually, with teeth, to actually hold some of the, I would say, improprieties of some of our ministers and government officials to account, and basically say, look, we are governed by the same law that applies to every Australian citizen.
Look, I agree wholeheartedly with the comments by both Cheryl and Jim, and I think I'd go further. I mean, I think you need to clean up Parliament itself.
Yep.
And one place to start, you talk about theatrics, is question time.
Yep.
Yes, most definitely.
One change there is to get rid of the Dorothy Dix question.
Absolutely.
I would have all questions to the government.
Yep.
All questions to the government. No Dorothy Dixes, because they're always of the same form. Tell us what your position is, and have you seen of it or heard of any alternative? And of course,
will you update the house? Will you update the house?
You can clean it up, everything from question time right through to the parliamentary committee systems and so on. And secondly, though, you've got to start looking at campaign funding and the influence of vested interests, outside interests, narrow interests that actually do have a big impact can have a determining impact on a government which is not publicly accountable. The ICAC is fundamentally important in cleaning that up, I think, but also you need to address the issue of lobbying and access for lobbyists and so on. But I'd like to go a little bit further and look at some of the other changes that you might make. I mean, in the business community and advertising sector, for example, there's something called truth in advertising.
Yep. Why
don't we apply that to political advertising? Put a limit on campaign spending on advertising, and have a requirement for truth, a redefined concept of truth, I think. And secondly, in the business community in particular, you have this concept of false and misleading conduct, with serious penalties. I mean, why don't we apply those standards to our parliamentary leaders? So I just think that the electorate is tired of being, lied to, misrepresented, misled, whatever way you look at it, and you take the extreme view of a Trump where he, whatever he says is right and everyone else is wrong. It's all fake news. We've gone an enormous race to the bottom in all of this. So there's a lot you can do to clean up Parliament. And I agree with Cheryl, both sides of politics know this. They just think they can exploit the system better than the other side.
Exactly.
They don't want to change it.
No, I even had it said to me, well, it could be better, but really when we get there, we'll just do it all back to them. So we'll store it up until that time.
Neither party has an interest in reforming the system because they benefit from it. And one aspect of there are two things I would say to this. One, I think, John, is what we were chatting about the other day, about personal advisors, ministerial advisors, who are basically outside the accountability structure. And they're sort of sacrificial lambs, and I don't mean them in any innocent sense, but the sacrificial lambs for the minister at any given time, because the minister can't be held accountable. It's the fault of the advisor who's made a mistake. They genuinely try to do the right thing, but et cetera, et cetera. So we need that cleaned up. And the second thing I think that needs to happen, it probably won't happen in my lifetime, but we need to actually radically change our electoral system. So it means that the dominant political parties do not have, in a sense, a monopoly of controlling the electoral process and the electoral outcomes. I mean, dare we say it, should we move to a New Zealand system where some form of proportional representation operates? Maybe the Tasmanian system should operate nationwide. I'm not sure of the full ramifications, but it would seem to me a far better process than the one sort of single member electorate where you can have a majority of the popular vote, but you don't necessarily get to form a government, and that both parties have had that sort of suffer, if you like, they've suffered that effect. But the real point is when they get to government, they're governing for the whole country. But because of the way in which the adversarial process is set up, most of the time, most governments pay lip service to governing for the whole nation, but in fact, they're simply governing for those who supported them, and particularly, coming back to John's point, the financial supporters in particular.
We're bringing in the wrong people into Parliament. I mean, the sort of skills you need to get pre-selected in the Liberal or Labor Party these days, sort of factional deals and backroom deals that you need to do to get pre-selected, are not going to stand you in very good stead to be a senior minister with a multi-billion-dollar portfolio to manage. A lot of the people that have emerged in politics in recent decades have come through the political system. They've only had political jobs, whether they've worked as ministerial advisors or they've worked in the party organisation or in a union or in local government or some part of the structure. They've got themselves pre-selected, and they have never really had a job, a real job. They've never done anything, and suddenly they've got a big portfolio like education or defence, which they really have no skill set or experience to manage. And it shows up as a fundamental weakness of our system that we end up with the wrong people in the wrong jobs trying to solve very serious problems. And so inevitably the process has become more and more adversarial, more and more short-term, more and more scoring points on each other, shifting the blame to the other side and kicking all the issues down the road, not solving the problems, not governing. And that's why we're suffering. And you see it manifests itself in different ways in response to this COVID crisis, but it's still there, and it's the background flavour against which everything's being done.
I'd like to see a change so that the ministers like Dutton, who are in the House of Representatives, aren't required to front any Senate committees. It's just the convention. And so you get senators representing them. And that they can duck having to answer questions forever. I think that is a major failing. I understand the difference between the Senate and the House of Representatives, but this is about ministerial accountability for programs. And I think the minister should have to be an answer for those programs, that the buck stops with them. And Dutton has been able to avoid being questioned forever because he's never required to appear before any committees. And I just think that's wrong. Secondly, I think ministerial advisors should be summoned to appear before Senate committees as well. They're two little things which I can't see the major parties agreeing to, but they are two things which could, I think, even now change a level of accountability. I would like to see Peter Dutton grilled by some of those forensic, particularly the women on the Senate estimates committees.
I would like to see him referred to the High Court for his legitimacy.
I think, Cheryl, I think you're making a really excellent point.
Yeah.
One reform could be to have specific joint parliamentary committees that cover both houses.
Yes.
And the reform basically means that all members of Parliament are subject to their scrutiny in one way or another. So in Mr. Dutton's case, I think he's got many cases to answer here, presiding over billion-dollar tenders that don't seem to have any rhyme or reason to them and no sort of audit trail that we can identify with particular things. But all that to one side, every minister should be accountable for the budget, for the money that they spend. They're spending public money, okay? And so they are therefore have to be accountable. And I understand that there's a convention that the upper house doesn't interfere in the lower house, all of that sort of thing. Well, that might have been fine in the old days of early federation where things might have been a bit slower and more genteel. But, we're now in the 21st century and we have people presiding over billion-dollar budgets, which basically it's public money that they're accountable for. The Parliament has an audit office that holds the Parliament accountable, holds the government accountable for spending the money that the Parliament approves. Why not the next step? Individual ministers should be accountable for their portfolios and the allocations they're given. It's public money, they need to account for it.
If I could go back to the question of reform of the system, the Electoral Commission, I think, has been seriously emasculated. And I think faith in democracy has been seriously eroded by that whole Gladys Liu, those signs outside the polling booths, which were identical to the Electoral Commission's colouring, etc. But didn't hold up in court. The Electoral Commission said there was nothing wrong with them, and that was the starting point. And there have been many questionable decisions by this, in the last 3 years in particular, by this particular Electoral Commission. And I don't know if it's captive. I don't know the people involved, but I do know it's been seriously defunded, and that's many of the agencies can't do their accountability work because they are lacking in resources deliberately. The other thing is the New Zealand system, or Michael Macklin, a former Democrat senator, used to always talk about we could abolish the number of House of Reps seats that we've got in terms of reducing the number, amalgamate several adjoining seats and have multi-member electorates, so that if, say, I lived in Dixon still and Peter Dutton was my member, there's no way in the world I would go to him for anything, or nor would he ever represent any of my beliefs. And I think the single member electorate is something that's probably had its day too. But again, Jim, who's going to do this? I can't see anybody taking up anything like this.
Look, I think if you needed an au pair, you might go to Dutton.
I don't need one, I'm too old now.
One of the things that I think, we talk about what's possible, I suppose, and we've got to keep remembering that it was possible for this government to shift its political position, to do an about-face and do a whole lot of things. But what drove that was the fact that it was the sheer necessity of having to protect people's health, and subsequently also protect the economy. So necessity was driving it. And to talk about reforming the political system, we need to find some level of necessity, some means of sort of enforcing some degree of pressure for political change.
Or we need to have a hung parliament with some really savvy people demanding this list of reforms, which I'd be really happy to write for them, as the price of government. I'd love to see something like that happen.
John, can I ask you, John, I'm interested in this idea of Commonwealth-state relations. Scott Morrison has taken to making some announcements about issues which are clearly the responsibility of the states. Schools, for example, would be a good case. Has COVID-19 changed Commonwealth-state relations and responsibilities?
Well, I think we've started to recognise the substance of some of those relations. I mean, Commonwealth doesn't own any schools or hospitals, so they really, are not in a position to declare the policy positions in relation to those, even though they do control some of the funding of both, and therefore you've seen an attempt by the government, by Morrison, to use the funding to enforce his position. For example, when he wanted schools to be opened, he offered independent schools an early payment of their annual support if they were opened by a certain date, trying to overarch what the state governments, particularly Victoria at the time, was wanting to do. I think, though, there should be an opportunity in this national cabinet to say, okay, one of the big reform challenges in our country is to make the federation work better. Mm-hmm. And the scope for doing that may be there. We go back to the old chestnuts, the original issues like overlap and duplication. You have very large federal departments of education and health, for example, which really basically spend a lot of time monitoring what the states do and trying to allocate money to achieve particular ends from their point of view, rather than saying, okay, let's give all education the responsibility for the delivery of the service and the policy development to the states, and the Commonwealth get out of it. I mean, I used the example recently that Canada doesn't have a national minister for education. It's a strictly provincial responsibility. And I think there are a lot of areas in which that is the case, where you could actually allocate the responsibility to one level of government, or where it's shared, and it's awkwardly shared in some cases, like the environment, like industrial relations, and so on. I mean, it leads to confusion. It opens up the possibility of the blame game. and therefore, we don't have as efficient a structure as we should. And I think, every time I think about the differences in road rules and taxes between states and, a multiplicity of differences in a small nation, it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. Surely you can do a deal which allocates responsibilities, standardises some of the legislation where it's a shared responsibility, and in that sense build a more effective structure of government. The other side then is, okay, let's assume you can get an effective and fair structure of government, is the financing of that. And here we have shared taxing powers. Ironically, some of the best, most efficient taxes from a conceptual point of view, like payroll tax and land tax, are state taxes, and they get neutered by competition between the states, so their effectiveness gets reduced. Yet we have hybrid taxes like the GST, where clever political move by Howard to give the revenue notionally to the states, guaranteeing an annual shitfight about its distribution, not working very well, and it hasn't turned out to be the growth tax that people thought it would be, because what's included in the tax is growing less fast than what's not included, so the tax base is being eroded.
And it didn't.
There are a lot of big issues to get a fair, simple, effective tax system on the other side of a proper allocation of functions and responsibilities.
I think on one level, with Scott Morrison being the Prime Minister, it's not surprising that he came out to be the leader after all the National Cabinet meetings, but it became clear early on anyway that he was complicating the message in a way that I think a leader shouldn't have done or wouldn't have done if he had a greater clarity of the realities that what was happening in those meetings was that Andrews and others weren't agreeing with him, and he ought to build that into his rhetoric. I think he improved as time went on, but for those who pay no attention to, or who know little about our history or our federation, and that's a huge number of Australians who watch very little news as well, they would have gone away with the impression that, he's in charge, he's making the decisions. Then it would depend what state you lived in, how much further attention you paid to the restrictions around schools and all the rest of it, which became bigger issues. But I think he did give the impression, quite deliberately, that he was running the show, despite what our federation says about the share of responsibilities.
That's right. I mean, he came off a very bad performance in the bushfires, having not really done himself a lot of service through the drought as well. So he had to come on to the front foot, be proactive rather than reactive, try to lead, and he's created this impression that he's in control. He's got the overarching framework within which everyone's doing their bit. I mean, that sounded okay, but basically the reality was that when you pushed it, individual states were going to do what they did. Three of them, I think, closed their borders, a different pace on schools, both in closing and opening and so on, and a host of other elements of the package, which I guess over time, Morrison's had to concede. And I noticed in recent press conferences, he's basically saying, that's the states you've got to go, where it's difficult, because at one stage he's saying in terms of schools, just listen to your Premier.
Yeah.
Then he says, no, I'm setting the standard. They're all going to, the mixed messages then became a big issue. Yeah. And of course, some of the big decisions early on about, restricting the number of people to 500 people in a gathering. And we can delay that decision till Monday on the basis that I want to go to the footy on Saturday and I've got a church service on Sunday, sort of thing. Yeah. That confused the issue. And I doubt that any of that was really based on medical advice. That I don't think those medicos sat around saying 500's the number, but suddenly 10 was the number and then 2 was the number. And, I just think that they complicated the process much more than it needed to be, even though I think that has been an effective framework for hammering out some of these differences and having the states do what they are empowered to do under the Constitution. And, I guess in the end, we've got through it. But the big issues are yet to come. I mean, it's okay to have done what we've done and the impact that they had to have had on the economy, but turning that around, the recovery phase, may take a lot longer and be much more politically difficult and bring about a lot of differences in state responses as time goes on.
I think, John, that the leadership issue is still a big question mark in the sense of the Prime Minister's ability to be a leader. I think, following on from what you said, there's a sense in which he would emerge from those meetings with the National Cabinet, and it sounded like a marketing plan for a leader. What does the leader need to say? And so here we get a series of leadership homilies that keep people happy, make them comfortable that someone's in charge. And then it unravels because this bit doesn't fit with that bit, and a state premier comes out and contradicts him. So he's sort of stuck with this sort of inability to lead, I think. It's just one of those dimensions. And while I might be being a bit harsh in saying that, on the other side, whatever that might look like of this process, here's today is where the Prime Minister and the National Cabinet, but the Prime Minister as a government and the government needs to be saying, this is where we see things in a year's time. At the moment, what we're getting seems to be what we're seeing in a year's time. Actually, it's only in 6 weeks' time, and it looks much like it was 6 months ago.
Yes.
And
they didn't have any ideas when they came in, when they were elected anyway. So,
but there's absolutely no way in the world that, you know, the 750,000 people who are officially unemployed as a result of COVID, not to mention the other million who are struggling, have been struggling to find work, and the other million who are underemployed or have been underemployed and who are not going to find work now for the time being, there's absolutely no sense that this is going to impact for a long time. And it's not just simply the employers or the businesses that once were are going to suddenly spring back to life. Many of those are going to disappear and resurface. The business people may resurface doing other things. They may themselves end up being unemployed, as I know a number of people running small businesses, very small businesses, owner type businesses, have ended up basically unemployed themselves.
Yeah.
So I get no sense that the Prime Minister has, or the Treasurer, are even willing to grapple with that and say to the Australian public, look, it ain't going to be fine in 6 weeks' time or 6 months. It's still going to be a struggle. And there are things that we need to do as a nation. But they're not talking like that. They're talking as if, you know, we just had a bad case of the flu and we're over it now. And in a couple of weeks, we'll all be right as rain and the footy will be on.
Yeah.
And that is the way government operates in Australia, though, in this very short-term environment in which they operate, and the focus being short-term. I mean, they look cynically at a bushfire or a drought and say, okay, the bushfire season will end, it'll ultimately rain, we'll just move on. We won't learn anything from that process. We won't prepare better for the next one, which is inevitable and probably going to be more significant and more intense than the last one. We won't learn, we won't do anything to improve the resilience and drought resistance of our soils, for example. We'll just wait for the next drought. And that mentality is pretty much evident in this. We'll get through this pandemic. The economy will snap back, bounce back. Your point about marketing slogans, it's all slogans. There's no substance to that slogan. There's no detail behind that slogan. It's more a hope or an assumption than it is a policy response. In those circumstances, you know, it's hard to get a government to break out. Go back to the election, go back to the pre-COVID period. We were being told the economy is strong and our commitment is to make it stronger. Again, slogans. When in fact the economy was weak and getting weaker and having very significant structural issues, which were just being ignored. And okay, so you got off the hook of having to deliver a budget surplus. Now you're delivering the world's largest, historically our largest ever budget deficit with enormous debt consequences. And that's going to linger for years, maybe decades in terms of its impact. And we won't talk about that. It will just bounce back, snap back, and 850,000 jobs by the end of July, which just isn't going to happen.
And I think, can I just say one more thing? I see a crossover between lack of accountability and lack of new ideas in the commission that he set up, because the chair of that commission has links with the gas industry. And guess what the way forward is? It's gas. So we're just going down the same old track, the same vested interests as we have before. And I'm filled with dread that they have no vision, except maybe we might keep telehealth working at some level, and we might have more working from home options for people. But in terms of basic ideology, I do not have much confidence that the things that I think are important are going to change. And that
the Canadians today have announced that their lending in support of business is going to be tied to their performance in relation to their climate commitments in terms of the Paris Accord. So you're going to get assistance if you can demonstrate that you are moving your business to a lower carbon situation. And that's the way you should innovatively be thinking, and not going back to more coal-fired power stations and more coal mines and more gas, more reliance on gas, all of which, may be short-term possibilities, but in a medium-term sense, we have to make a transition to a low-carbon society by the middle part of this century, and they're going exactly the wrong way about it.
I'm interested, John, in the idea of evidence-based policy. Medical experts have been fairly prominent in this crisis. They're standing in the press conferences and the announcements next to the Prime Minister. Yet they seem to be ignored on other issues of seriousness, like climate change. How do we encourage evidence-based policy in other areas? And why has it not been listened to in other areas that we've been thinking about?
I think it's fair to say that even in this crisis, the reliance on evidence has been selective. And I wouldn't say that you've had a uniformity of medical advice, for example. Nothing like you've got in the climate area, where just 97, 98% of peer-assessed climate scientists all agree that we have a significant and urgent problem that we need to address. That hasn't been the uniformity view on the medical side. You trot out people that support your view or that on whose advice you're going to rely. It is a step in the right direction, don't get me wrong. At least they're doing it. At least they're acknowledging expertise, and they're acknowledging science and medical expertise. But I mean, they should apply that across the board in all policy. And, when I first got involved in politics in the early 70s, I did so, coming out of the Reserve Bank, a passion for large-based reform, which in the end cost me election. But I was very confident that good evidence-based public policy would be good government and good politics with a reasonably short lag. And there's today it's short-term politics that's stopping any idea of evidence-based policy. You don't want evidence. Jim's just made the point about the erosion of the standing of the public service. The fearless, independent advice that you used to get from the public servant, you don't get today. And they're not tenured anymore. They're on contracts. Their jobs are sacrificed very easily and very quickly with a change of government or the whim of a minister or the government. So, I mean, we've lost the capacity to do this. And a lot of the public servants, I do quite a lot of briefing at senior public servants, and quite often they'll say, we don't know what to do. We could spend the time, develop the evidence, put together a good piece of policy. But there are those who think they should just tell the minister what they want to hear, or what they think they want to hear, or maybe they'll put up what they think they can get up through the political process. It is not the role of a public servant. It's not the way you're going to generate the right sort of evidence. So I think that is a really big challenge. And climate's a classic case where you've got just about everyone on one side saying the same thing, except you've got a handful of deniers in the government who think that they know better.
And just following on from what you're saying, John, there needs to be a fundamental reform again to the way in which the public service operates and the way in which ministers are held to account, and their particular policy pronouncements and the alleged evidence upon which that policy pronouncement rests, that needs to be held up to some form of proper scrutiny. And this involves a substantial reform to the Westminster system and its constitutional basis, for that matter. And given that neither major party is interested or has anything to gain, I think that's probably the better way of putting it. They have nothing to gain from improving accountability and responsibility. So there's little likelihood that the major parties will do something. But the Senate might be a way in which some change can be forced, because fortunately the government doesn't always have control of the Senate. And it's when the government lacks control of the Senate that some degree of change gets to be possible, because in ideal circumstances, there might be an alliance within the Senate that can force the government into taking on action that it wouldn't otherwise contemplate. And I'm not talking about the one or two individuals holding balance of power and making quite outrageous demands in return for getting what they want, etc., etc. I'm sort of talking about a general cross-party alliance in the Senate that says, okay, we need to make a change for the better here, and we will initiate it. We will not cooperate with the government unless there's a commitment from the government to begin some serious level of reform in which accountability, ministerial advisors, and other reforms are on the agenda.
Jim, is this at the heart of a disillusionment with government generally? How would you sum up the general disillusionment or malaise?
Well, it's a lack of trust, because mostly what you see is not what you get. Mostly politicians, senior ministers, prime ministers will say one thing and do another. Now, there's a place where sometimes prime ministers can't tell you the truth. They can't come out and say, X is X because of some serious issue, some national security issue, or even indeed some panic issue that they're trying to contain. Most people understand that there are occasions when governments have to be, to some extent, less than genuine with the truth, so to speak. But what people don't accept, I think, and what we're sick and tired of, is governments playing us for mugs. And I think that realization is happening over and over again. The rise of populist parties, for example, are not just simply, a bunch of lunatics. Some of them might be, but they're actually people who are just simply, in many respects, just fed up with governments across the two parties, basically, playing them for fools. And I think.
So, Cheryl, what's the role of the media in all of this?
Well, I'm disappointed that we're still operating on an old style media very much, which is get your big one story for the day and move on. And we have a handful of good journalists, I think, who, as Laura Tingle used to say, want to do more than just chase fire engines or ambulances, who actually want to dig down into and keep hold of the themes and draw the threads together, join the dots and actually get some answers. But the news cycle being what it is, and the way in which we've moved from, I reckon when I started politics, it was you don't publish an allegation unless you've done some research into whether it's got any factual basis, to, oh, they said it, it's news, I'll worry about whether it's right afterwards, someone else will come along and check that. And we've changed that onus, that responsibility for fact-checking so radically in the last, I reckon, 20 years that it's very detrimental to reasonable political discourse. If we're not going to have fact-checking, if leaders are willing to lie and we don't have a fourth estate that says that's not okay because I've got my story for today and it's not about that, then I don't see how we're going to get out of this, except for the much maligned Twitter, where at its best, it can provide an accountability outlet that people, they hang on to it. They pursue things like the destroy the joint hashtag, which Alan Jones found very inconvenient by the end, and the pursuing of advertisers on Sky News, for example. Citizens have had to take the responsibility, not the media. And maybe there is a way forward in that.
I'll pick up a couple of points there. First, Jim's idea of this holding the government to account by some sort of alliance. I mean, it's been put to me a number of times over the last few years that we should have an alliance in, say, the Senate or across the Parliament, which basically is built around one principle. If it's genuine government, if it's genuine reform, we'll support it, otherwise we won't. whether it's a new party or whether it's an alliance of existing members of parliament or existing minority parties and independents or whatever. And there's some merit to that thinking, which is the sort of point you've been making. You've got to have a mechanism by which they are held accountable for not solving a problem. How many decades are we going to let them kick the climate change issue down the road? How high do we want electricity and gas prices to go as a result? I mean, these are big issues. In terms of the media, I think the change is just enormous. The way that even, you notice the press conferences, the daily press conferences now with Morrison, each journalist gets a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no follow-up. I can remember, you mentioned Laura Tinkle, I can remember her asking me about 35 straight questions about an element of my policy, which was totally irrelevant.
Yeah. And now it's about...
I've advised her to go and chase ambulances. It was a much better use of her time. But I mean, this doesn't happen today. And you notice how Trump has taken that one step more. He attacks the individual journalist while they're asking a question.
Yep.
You know, they're nutbags, or they shouldn't be asking that question. How dare you? You know, this is how, you know, it is a race to the bottom, this process in the media. And with a diversity of platforms now, and with the major traditional players really struggling to maintain any support, any advertising support, you know, it's opened it up quite a lot. But that's the scope for good investigative journalism has really taken a hit.
We've got a few questions from our audience, if I can put them to you. The first one's from Louise and also from Steve. So thanks, Louise, and thanks, Steve. What can I as an individual do other than vote? How can we as citizens make a difference as an individual citizen? What advice have you got for the citizens out there?
Well, you know, it's quite depressing, because people used to say, oh, I'll sign a petition, I'll write a letter to the editor. I'd say forget about that. I don't see any petitions making much of an impact in Parliament, no matter how many people sign them. And I think letters to the editor, they're interesting to read, but they don't have that critical mass behind them. I don't even think demonstrations, the way Australians do them, have any effect anymore. We seem to be very complacent about following up on the passion and the anger we feel at being treated so disrespectfully in a democratic system. I can only do what I think matters is talking to people, talking to other, like having discourse with people you work with, actually saying, did you know that? If you've got the facts, paying attention to the facts. I find I can have a good conversation with people who may disagree with me to start with, but are willing to at least listen, hear me out for a short time. And I would like to see us all do better civics education of our own children and teenagers, people that we deal with, because most people in Australia know very little about how our system of government operates.
Jim?
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think necessarily that writing letters to the editor or signing petitions is entirely useless. I understand where you're coming from, Cheryl, but there's an educative dimension around the letter to the editor, because assuming the paper will publish it or the forum will publish it, it gets a view out, and it maybe someone reads it and changes their mind or goes, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that before. With petitions, particularly with the online petitions, they may not have any impact when it gets to the Parliament. And they just pile up the paper or the electronic file or whatever. But the circulation of the petition, sending it off, you get it comes in your inbox, you go, oh yeah, okay, I think that's a good cause to be supporting, and you send it off to a friend or 10 friends or whatever. And that in itself also becomes a little bit educational, in the sense that you're alerting others who may not have thought about the issue to think about it and sign it. I think that, for individuals, it's really, really hard. I think there also needs to be, again, systemic reform, some rollback of some of the outrageous laws that target whistleblowers, that invade people's privacy, that empower authorities to do things that, really speaking, are infringements of genuine, reasonable liberty. And the onus shifts from the issue of proving somebody guilty to the individual having to prove their own innocence. And it seems to me that that is a chilling effect. It may not chill people directly, but it has a cumulative sort of effect on the way in which people behave in public spaces, in the civic community. And it seems to me that some of those things need to be rolled back so that we have a sense of actual being trusted by our government, because that generates and accentuates our level of mistrust. Not only do we hear them lying to us about all sorts of things, they then treat us like we're the problem. And I'm sort of reminded that quote of, I think there was a poem that Bertolt Brecht wrote about, the people elected the wrong government. Well, the government just have to elect the better people. So it seems to me that it's hard for individuals, but there are ways and means, I think.
Look, I think it is very frustrating. I mean, the old Churchill line, never give up. I mean, you just have to take every opportunity to be heard in whatever way you can, whatever level you can, whether it's your local member, the newspaper, signing a petition or whatever. But I've taken great heart in recent years that some of these social media campaigns, like was Arab Spring, for example, you can actually drive big change if you can get that sort of momentum. And I guess at a political level, Obama used it quite effectively, not only from the point of view of his fundraising, which was millions of very small donations, but also in terms of marshalling the independents and minorities to come out and vote, which was fundamental to him getting elected. So I think you don't want to underestimate the power of these new platforms as long as they're effectively used. And I still don't see our political parties using them at all effectively. I do think that there's some hope for upside on that. I understand the short-term frustration. You seem powerless. These issues seem so big, so complex, so beyond anything we might individually do. Although when I look at climate, a lot of the adjustment that's made in response to climate has been individual households and individual businesses getting on and doing it anyway. Cities declaring climate emergencies, local government taking an active part. These are all layers of actually getting the job done when there's no national leadership.
Our time's nearly up, but I wonder, would each of you just like to make a final observation? Cheryl?
I'm with John. I never give up, but I think it's just frustratingly difficult at the moment. But I do think that even the Australians that haven't been politically engaged at a high level have had time during this lockdown period to take stock of a few things that have and haven't worked. And I do think, as I said before, that we will see some changes that will probably assist the way we fund health, fund education, and look at how the future of work, which I think will be positive things for the future. As for our Parliament, I'm waiting for that inquiry into question time to be published, and I'm holding my breath for a long time.
Jim?
Yep, I'd have to agree with you, Cheryl. There's a lot that needs to be done, but I think if we was to sort of take away from what's been going on for the time being, the lessons for democracy, if you like, and when we look at what's happened in the US and the UK, I think the lessons, and to some extent the Morrison government acts as if it's taken heed, ideology-driven politics is not the basis for good policy outcomes. We need ideas with values and so forth, but basically using ideology to ignore evidence in a whole range of areas is not good policy. Evidence counts. And regardless, I think, of the quality of the evidence used currently through the COVID, that there's been sort of variations there, it was still some form of medically based evidence that was used. They could have used better evidence perhaps, but they used enough to get us to a point where we've made the pandemic at least on hold for the time being. And finally, I'd say that, it's highlighted the fact that significant reforms to our political system are needed to ensure that our democracy our political system, if you like, becomes more robust, and that politicians are actually held accountable for what they do in our name. And they have a responsibility, and maybe the time is coming when people are going to react in ways that they perhaps would rather not happen. But I think that at the moment, people are aware that the system politically may not be as robust as it needs to be.
John?
I'd say that it's unfortunate that in our political system it takes a crisis to get any sort of sense of proactive government and government leadership. I'm encouraged by the fact that in this crisis we have seen ideology put to one side, essentially, and we've seen a reliance to a degree on evidence, and don't waste the crisis. Now build on that. Restructure our processes of government federally and make our federation work. See the potential that is there. When people have demonstrated, people have done things they never imagined they'd do over the last 6 or 8 weeks. They've changed their lifestyle, they've changed their work habits, they've changed their travel, and so on. Capitalise on that sense of collaboration and cooperation to achieve a national goal. So set us some national goals to a couple of decades out, and let's put the policy frameworks in place that will achieve those sort of objectives. And I outline to everyone what role they are expected to play in that process. You've done it in relation to the crisis forced on you. Now use that as a platform to do something positive moving forward.
Well said. Well said.
Yes.
It brings us to the topic of our webinar next month, which is the future is not what it was. The economy and the world of work. And our panellists next month will be Alison Pennington from the Australia Institute and the Centre for Future Work, Angela Jackson from Equity Economics, and Professor Will Rivkin from the University of Newcastle. I hope you can all join us then. I wonder, would you please give a big thank you to our panellists, John and Cheryl and Jim. Thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your expertise, and for your willingness to share it with all of us. And also a big thank you to the members of the Newcastle Institute, without whom Newcastle Institute would not exist. If you'd like to become a member, details are on our website, newcastleinstitute.org.au. And thank you also to Robin Considine, Ross Kerridge, Matt Thomas, Brett Cameron, Roger Pryor, Alan Spicer, and Murray Dunn, who work tirelessly behind the scenes to make these sorts of events a reality and make them possible. So thanks again to you, John, and to Jim and to Cheryl. And we look forward to catching up again with you soon. So
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.
Bye.
Bye. Okay.